Sarah Martinez had always believed that love could conquer anything. At 26, she was a kindergarten teacher with bright eyes and an optimistic heart. She lived in a small apartment in downtown Chicago, where she spent her evenings grading papers and planning activities for her students. Life was simple, peaceful, and exactly how she liked it. Everything changed when she met David Thompson at a coffee shop near her school. He was charming, well-dressed, and had a smile that made her forget about everything else. David worked in what he called import and export business, driving expensive cars and always having plenty of money to spend on fancy dinners and weekend trips. For 6 months, Sarah felt like she was living in a fairy tale. David showered her with gifts, took her to the best restaurants in the city, and made her feel like the most important person in the world. He was attentive, romantic, and seemed to understand her in ways no one else ever had. Sarah's friends were impressed by how well David treated her, and even her cautious mother seemed to approve of the relationship. But slowly, things began to change. David started asking questions about where she went, who she talked to, and what she did during her free time. At first, Sarah thought it was sweet that he cared so much about her daily life. She would tell him about her conversations with other teachers, her lunch plans with friends, and her evening routines. David would listen carefully, sometimes asking for more details about the people she mentioned. The questions became more frequent and more specific. David wanted to know the names of her male colleagues, whether any parents of her students had tried to talk to her, and if she had noticed anyone following her or acting strangely around her. When Sarah asked why he was so concerned, David would kiss her forehead and say he just wanted to make sure she was safe. Then came the gifts that felt more like chains. David bought her a new phone, explaining that her old one had poor security features. He installed several apps on it, saying they would help keep her safe and allow them to stay in better contact. The phone had a tracking feature that let David know where she was at all times. When Sarah expressed discomfort about this, David explained that the city was dangerous and he worried about her walking alone. David also gave her a new laptop, claiming her old one was too slow for her teaching work. Like the phone, it came with software that he said would protect her from hackers and online threats. Sarah began to notice that David seemed to know about her online activities, her emails, and even her private conversations with friends through social media. The most unsettling gift was a necklace with a small pendant that David said was a family heirloom. The pendant felt unusually heavy, and David insisted she wear it every day. He became upset if she forgot to put it on, saying it was important for her safety. Sarah later discovered that the pendant contained a tiny listening device that allowed David to hear her conversations even when they were apart. As weeks passed, David's behavior became increasingly controlling. He would show up at her school unexpectedly, claiming he was in the neighborhood and wanted to surprise her. He began commenting on her clothing choices, suggesting that certain outfits might attract unwanted attention from other men. David started dropping her off at work and picking her up, saying he enjoyed spending the extra time with her. Sarah's friends began to notice changes in her behavior. She canceled plans more frequently, always explaining that David had made special arrangements for them. When she did spend time with friends, she seemed nervous and distracted, constantly checking her phone for messages from David. Her best friend, Maria, tried to talk to her about the relationship, expressing concern that David seemed too possessive. During one particularly tense conversation, Maria pointed out that Sarah had become isolated from her support system. Sarah's visits to her parents had become less frequent, and she had stopped participating in activities she once enjoyed. When Maria suggested that David's behavior was controlling, Sarah became defensive, insisting that he was just protective because he cared about her. The situation escalated when David began making decisions about Sarah's life without consulting her. He contacted her landlord and arranged to have additional security measures installed in her apartment, including new locks and a security system that he could monitor remotely. David told Sarah that he had received information suggesting she might be in danger, though he was vague about the details of this supposed threat. David also began interfering with Sarah's work life. He would call the school, claiming to be concerned about her safety and asking detailed questions about her schedule and the security measures at the building. The school principal became uncomfortable with these calls and spoke to Sarah about the situation. Sarah felt embarrassed and confused, unsure how to explain David's behavior without making it seem like she was in some kind of trouble. The breaking point came during a dinner at an upscale restaurant. David had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, checking his phone frequently and seeming distracted. When Sarah asked if everything was okay, David's expression became serious and somewhat frightening. He leaned across the table and spoke in a low voice that made Sarah's heart race. David explained that his business involved working with people who didn't tolerate disrespect or betrayal. He said that anyone who became involved with him, even romantically, became part of a world where loyalty was everything and mistakes could be deadly. David told Sarah that he had enemies who might try to hurt her to get to him, which was why he had been so careful about her safety and security. As David spoke, Sarah began to understand that his import and export business was likely something much more dangerous and illegal than she had imagined. The expensive cars, the unlimited money, the mysterious phone calls, and the paranoid behavior all started to make sense in a terrifying way. Sarah realized that she had unknowingly become involved with someone who lived outside the law. David continued his explanation, telling Sarah that their relationship meant she was now under his protection, whether she wanted it or not. He said that people in his line of work didn't believe in casual relationships and that anyone who knew about his business activities could never be allowed to simply walk away. David's tone was calm, but his words carried an unmistakable threat. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she understood the implications of what David was telling her. She was trapped in a relationship with a man who was involved in criminal activities, and he was making it clear that leaving wouldn't be simple or safe. The romantic gestures and expensive gifts had been ways of drawing her deeper into his world, and now she was too involved to easily escape. That night, Sarah lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything David had told her. The man she had fallen in love with was essentially holding her prisoner, using fear and the threat of danger to control her movements and decisions. She thought about her students, her family, and the peaceful life she had built for herself, all of which now seemed to be slipping away. The next morning, David acted as if their conversation at dinner had never happened. He brought her coffee and pastries, kissed her goodbye, and reminded her to keep her phone charged and nearby at all times. Sarah went through the motions of her normal routine, teaching her kindergarten class and interacting with her colleagues, but inside, she felt like she was screaming. During her lunch break, Sarah called Maria and asked to meet after work. She needed to talk to someone about her situation, but she wasn't sure how to explain what was happening without putting Maria in danger. David had made it clear that people in his world took threats seriously, and Sarah didn't want her friend to become a target. When Sarah met Maria at a quiet cafe, she struggled to find the words to explain her situation. She told her friend that David was involved in illegal activities and that she felt trapped in the relationship. Maria immediately suggested that Sarah contact the police, but Sarah explained that David had implied that law enforcement couldn't protect her from the people he worked with. Maria listened with growing alarm as Sarah described the level of control David exercised over her life. The tracking devices, the surveillance, the isolation from friends and family, and the veiled threats all painted a picture of a dangerous and escalating situation. Maria insisted that Sarah needed to find a way to break free from David's control, even if it meant leaving Chicago entirely. Sarah spent the next few days researching her options and trying to develop a plan for escape. She learned about domestic violence resources and witness protection programs, but nothing seemed adequate for her unique situation. David wasn't just an abusive boyfriend. He was a criminal with connections to dangerous people who had the resources and motivation to track her down anywhere she might try to hide. The situation became more urgent when David began talking about making their relationship more permanent. He mentioned moving in together, meeting his business associates, and becoming more deeply involved in his lifestyle. Sarah understood that each step deeper into David's world would make it harder for her to ever break free. During one terrifying conversation, David showed Sarah photographs of other women who had been involved with men in his line of work. Some of the women appeared to be living luxurious but heavily guarded lives, while others had simply disappeared from their normal lives entirely. David explained that these women had all made choices about how deeply they wanted to be involved, but none of them had been allowed to return to their previous lives. Sarah realized that she was facing a decision that would determine the entire course of her future. She could submit to David's control and accept a life of luxury mixed with fear and isolation, or she could find a way to fight back and reclaim her freedom. Neither option seemed safe. But staying with David would mean giving up everything that made her who she was. The pressure became unbearable when David announced that he wanted Sarah to meet his boss. He explained that this meeting would formalize her position in his world and provide her with additional protection from potential threats. David made it clear that this meeting wasn't optional and that refusing to participate would be seen as disrespectful to powerful people who didn't tolerate disrespect. Sarah knew that once she met David's criminal associates, there would be no possibility of returning to her normal life. These people would know her face, her name, and her connection to David. Even if she somehow managed to leave David later, these dangerous individuals would always see her as a potential threat who knew too much about their activities. In desperation, Sarah began researching alternatives that might help her escape from David's control without putting herself in even greater danger. She read about people who had successfully left criminal organizations, witness protection programs, and law enforcement strategies for dealing with organized crime. Most of the information she found was discouraging, emphasizing how difficult and dangerous it was to break free from these situations. Then Sarah found something that gave her a glimmer of hope. She read about cases where rival criminal organizations had provided protection to people fleeing from their enemies. The idea was risky and potentially even more dangerous than staying with David, but it represented a possibility for escape that didn't rely on law enforcement or conventional support systems. Sarah began researching the criminal landscape in Chicago, trying to understand the different groups and their relationships with each other. She learned about territorial disputes, business rivalries, and personal conflicts between various criminal leaders. Most importantly, she discovered that David's organization had several serious enemies who might be willing to help someone escape from his control. Sarah spent weeks gathering information about David's enemies before she finally worked up the courage to make contact. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, she learned about Vincent Romano, a powerful crime boss who controlled territory on the opposite side of Chicago from David's organization. According to everything she could find, Romano and David's boss had been engaged in a bitter rivalry for years. The decision to approach Romano was the most frightening choice Sarah had ever made. She knew that walking into the world of organized crime voluntarily could result in consequences far worse than anything David might do to her. But as David continued to pressure her about meeting his boss and making their relationship permanent, Sarah felt like she was running out of time and options. Finding a way to contact Romano proved more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. She couldn't simply look up his phone number or walk into his place of business. Through conversations with people who worked in restaurants and bars in Romano's territory, Sarah gradually learned about the social circles and public places where his associates might be found. Sarah began visiting an upscale Italian restaurant called Lucia's, which was rumored to be owned by someone connected to Romano's organization. She would sit at the bar during busy evening hours, listening to conversations and trying to identify people who might be able to help her make contact. The atmosphere was tense and sophisticated, with well-dressed men conducting quiet conversations in corner booths. After several visits to Lucia's, Sarah noticed a middle-aged woman named Elena, who seemed to command respect from the staff and other customers. Elena dressed elegantly, spoke with authority, and appeared to know everyone in the restaurant. Sarah observed that even the managers and owners treated Elena with special deference, suggesting she held an important position in the local hierarchy. Sarah spent 2 weeks building up the courage to approach Elena. She studied the woman's habits. Learning that Elena typically arrived at the restaurant on Tuesday evenings and sat at a specific table near the back. Elena usually dined alone, reading financial newspapers and occasionally taking phone calls that seemed to involve business matters. On a rainy Tuesday evening in March, Sarah finally approached Elena's table. Her heart was pounding as she walked across the restaurant, knowing that this conversation could either save her life or end it. Elena looked up from her newspaper with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate Sarah in a single glance. Sarah introduced herself and asked if she could speak privately about a matter involving David Thompson and his organization. Elena's expression didn't change, but she gestured for Sarah to sit down. In a calm, measured voice, Elena asked Sarah to explain her situation and why she thought it might be of interest to certain people in the neighborhood. Over the course of an hour, Sarah told Elena everything about her relationship with David, the control he exercised over her life, and the impossible situation she found herself in. Elena listened without interruption, occasionally asking specific questions about David's activities, his associates, and the level of information Sarah had access to. When Sarah finished her story, Elena was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering the implications of what she had heard. Finally, Elena explained that she might be able to arrange a meeting with someone who could help, but that such assistance would come with expectations and obligations that Sarah needed to understand clearly before proceeding. Elena warned Sarah that seeking protection from one criminal organization while fleeing another was extremely dangerous and could result in her becoming a pawn in conflicts she didn't understand. She explained that powerful people didn't provide help without expecting something valuable in return, and that Sarah would need to offer information or services that would be worth the risk of protecting her. Despite Elena's warnings, Sarah insisted that she was willing to do whatever was necessary to escape from David's control. Elena studied Sarah's face carefully, seeming to evaluate her sincerity and determination. After another long pause, Elena agreed to arrange a preliminary meeting, but she made Sarah promise to think carefully about whether she was truly prepared for the consequences of this decision. 3 days later, Elena called Sarah and provided instructions for a meeting that would take place the following evening. Sarah was told to come to a private club in Little Italy, where she would be met by someone who could discuss her situation in more detail. Elena emphasized that Sarah should tell no one about this meeting and should take extra precautions to ensure she wasn't being followed. The private club was located in the basement of an old building that looked unremarkable from the street. Sarah followed Elena's instructions, entering through a side door and identifying herself to a large man who was clearly providing security. The interior of the club was elegant and dimly lit, with leather furniture and artwork that suggested old-world sophistication. Sarah was escorted to a small private room where she waited nervously for nearly 20 minutes before the door opened. A tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit entered the room, followed by Elena and 2 other men who positioned themselves near the door. The distinguished man introduced himself simply as Mr. Romano and invited Sarah to explain her situation. Romano listened to Sarah's story with the same careful attention that Elena had shown, but his questions were more specific and focused on David's business operations. He wanted to know about David's routines, his security measures, his associates, and his relationships with other criminal organizations. Romano also asked about Sarah's own background, her family, and her connections to law enforcement or other potentially problematic individuals. As the conversation progressed, Sarah began to understand that Romano was evaluating her usefulness as a source of information about David's organization. He wasn't simply considering whether to help a woman escape from an abusive relationship. He was calculating whether protecting Sarah would provide strategic advantages in his ongoing conflicts with rival groups. Romano explained that providing protection for Sarah would require significant resources and would essentially declare war on David's organization. He couldn't make such a decision without understanding exactly what benefits his organization would receive in exchange for taking such risks. Romano made it clear that Sarah's safety would depend on her ability to provide valuable and ongoing intelligence about David's activities. Sarah felt sick as she realized what Romano was asking. He wanted her to become a spy, gathering information about David's criminal operations and reporting back to Romano's organization. This would mean continuing her relationship with David, at least temporarily, while secretly betraying him to his enemies. The level of danger and deception involved was terrifying to contemplate. Romano seemed to understand Sarah's distress, and his tone became somewhat more gentle as he explained the realities of her situation. He pointed out that David would never simply allow her to leave his organization, regardless of whether she sought protection elsewhere. David's associates would view her departure as a security threat and would likely take action to prevent her from sharing information about their activities. The crime boss continued his explanation, telling Sarah that her only realistic options were to submit completely to David's control or to fight back using whatever advantages she could find. Romano's organization could provide protection and resources, but only if Sarah was willing to actively contribute to their efforts against David's group. Sarah asked about the possibility of simply leaving Chicago entirely and starting a new life somewhere else. Romano shook his head, explaining that David's organization had connections throughout the country and that running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. He said that people in David's line of work didn't forget about security threats, and that Sarah would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder if she tried to simply disappear. Romano gave Sarah 3 days to decide whether she was willing to work with his organization. He warned her that once she committed to this course of action, there would be no turning back. Sarah would become a permanent enemy of David's organization, and her survival would depend entirely on Romano's continued protection and support. As Sarah left the private club that night, her mind was reeling with the impossible choice she was being forced to make. She could either submit to David's control and accept a life of fear and isolation, or she could become a spy in a war between criminal organizations. Neither option offered the safety and freedom she desperately wanted, but Romano's proposal at least offered hope for eventual escape. Over the next 3 days, Sarah went through the motions of her normal routine while secretly agonizing over her decision. David seemed to sense her distraction and became increasingly suspicious about her behavior. He questioned her about her activities, checked her phone more frequently, and began following her more closely throughout the day. Sarah's interactions with David became increasingly strained as she struggled to hide her knowledge of the choice she was facing. Every conversation felt like a test, with David probing for signs that Sarah might be planning something. She found herself analyzing everything David said and did, trying to understand his operations and routines in case she decided to work with Romano. The pressure reached a breaking point when David announced that the meeting with his boss had been scheduled for the following week. He explained that this meeting would finalize Sarah's position in his organization and would provide her with protection that no law enforcement agency could offer. David made it clear that refusing to attend this meeting would be seen as an act of betrayal. Sarah realized that she was out of time. If she was going to accept Romano's offer, she needed to make the decision immediately. The meeting with David's boss would eliminate any possibility of escape and would commit her to a life under David's control. But working with Romano would put her in constant danger and would require her to become someone she never thought she could be. That evening, Sarah called the number Elena had given her and left a coded message indicating that she was ready to proceed with Romano's proposal. Within hours, she received instructions for another meeting where she would receive detailed guidance about how to gather information and communicate safely with Romano's organization. At this second meeting, Romano introduced Sarah to a man named Tony, who would serve as her handler and primary contact. Tony was younger than Romano, but carried himself with the same air of authority and sophistication. He explained the technical aspects of spying, including communication methods, information-gathering techniques, and security measures that would help protect her identity. Tony provided Sarah with a special phone that looked identical to her normal device, but contained secure communication software. He taught her how to identify and photograph important documents, how to remember and report conversations accurately, and how to recognize signs that her activities might have been discovered. The training was intensive and frightening, making the reality of her new situation impossible to ignore. Romano also assigned 2 of his men to provide discreet surveillance and protection for Sarah. She was told that these men would monitor her activities and would intervene if David or his associates posed an immediate threat to her safety. However, Romano emphasized that this protection would only be effective if Sarah followed instructions carefully and avoided taking unnecessary risks. As Sarah prepared to return to her normal life as David's girlfriend, now secretly working as a spy for his enemies, she felt like she was entering a nightmare from which she might never wake up. Every aspect of her existence would now involve deception, danger, and the constant possibility of discovery. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt like she had some measure of control over her fate, even if that control came at a terrifying price. Sarah's double life began immediately after her training with Tony. She returned to David with a carefully practiced demeanor of nervous excitement about meeting his boss, while secretly documenting every detail of his organization's operations. The first weeks of spying were terrifying, as Sarah struggled to balance gathering information with maintaining her cover as David's devoted girlfriend. David's apartment became a treasure trove of intelligence that Sarah carefully photographed and reported to Romano's organization. She discovered detailed records of shipping schedules, financial transactions, and communications with criminal associates across multiple cities. Using the techniques Tony had taught her, Sarah memorized important conversations and documented the daily routines of key figures in David's organization. The scheduled meeting with David's boss took place at an exclusive private dining room in a downtown hotel. Sarah arrived wearing the elegant dress David had selected for her, knowing that Romano's surveillance team was positioned nearby to monitor the situation. David introduced her to Marcus Volkov, a cold-eyed man in his 50s who commanded obvious respect and fear from everyone around him. During the dinner, Volkov explained to Sarah that her relationship with David had made her part of their organization, whether she had chosen this or not. He described the loyalty and discretion that would be expected of her, along with the consequences for anyone who betrayed their trust. Volkov's tone was conversational, but his words carried unmistakable threats about what happened to people who became security risks. Sarah played her role perfectly, expressing gratitude for Volkov's protection and promising to support David and his work in whatever way she could. Inside, she was memorizing every word of Volkov's explanations about their operations, their enemies, and their future plans. The information she gathered during that single dinner provided Romano with intelligence that had taken his organization months to piece together through other sources. As weeks passed, Sarah became increasingly valuable to Romano's organization. Her access to David's inner circle allowed her to provide advance warning about planned operations, identify weaknesses in their security measures, and gather financial information that could be used to disrupt their business activities. Tony praised her natural ability for espionage, noting that her background as a teacher had given her excellent observational and communication skills. However, the psychological toll of living a double life began to affect every aspect of Sarah's existence. She found herself constantly on edge, analyzing every conversation for potential intelligence while simultaneously watching for signs that her true activities had been discovered. The stress of maintaining her cover while gathering dangerous information was exhausting and isolating. David's behavior toward Sarah began to change as Volkov's organization faced increased pressure from Romano's activities. David became more paranoid about security, questioning Sarah about her daily activities and monitoring her communications more closely. He also became more possessive and controlling, restricting her movements and insisting that she spend more time in his apartment where he could watch her constantly. The situation became even more dangerous when David began including Sarah in business meetings and criminal activities. He claimed that Volkov wanted her to understand their operations better so she could provide more effective support. In reality, this inclusion was also a test of Sarah's loyalty, as participation in criminal activities would make her complicit and less likely to cooperate with law enforcement if she were ever captured. Sarah found herself witnessing drug transactions, money laundering operations, and discussions about violent actions against Romano's organization. Every meeting provided valuable intelligence, but also increased her legal and physical risk. Tony assured her that Romano's organization would protect her from prosecution. But Sarah understood that these promises might be worthless if their activities were discovered. The most challenging aspect of Sarah's spying activities was maintaining her emotional connection with David while secretly working to destroy his organization. She had to express love and support for a man she now knew was a dangerous criminal, while gathering information that would ultimately lead to his imprisonment or death. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming and began to affect her psychological stability. Sarah's relationship with her family and friends deteriorated further as the demands of her spy work intensified. She was forced to cancel visits and social commitments to attend criminal meetings or surveillance activities. Her behavior became increasingly erratic and secretive, causing concern among people who cared about her but couldn't understand what was happening in her life. The breaking point came when David announced that Volkov wanted Sarah to participate in a major operation against Romano's organization. David explained that her role would involve delivering false information to someone connected to Romano, which would allow Volkov's group to ambush and eliminate several of Romano's key associates. Sarah realized that she was being used to set up the very people who were protecting her. This development presented Sarah with an impossible dilemma. If she participated in David's plan, she would be responsible for the deaths of people who had risked their lives to help her. But if she warned Romano's organization about the ambush, she would expose herself as a spy and face certain retaliation from Volkov's group. Sarah contacted Tony using their emergency communication protocol and explained the situation. Tony arranged an immediate meeting with Romano, who listened to Sarah's report with growing concern. Romano realized that Volkov had become suspicious about security leaks and was using Sarah to test whether there was a spy within his inner circle. Romano faced his own difficult decision about how to handle this crisis. He could extract Sarah immediately, but this would confirm Volkov's suspicions and would likely trigger a violent escalation between the organizations. Alternatively, he could allow Sarah to participate in the ambush while secretly preparing countermeasures, but this would put her in enormous danger and could result in casualties among his own people. After consulting with his advisors, Romano decided on a third option that would require extraordinary courage from Sarah. He wanted her to participate in David's plan while secretly providing Romano's organization with detailed information about the operation. This would allow Romano to turn the ambush around, capturing or killing Volkov's people while maintaining Sarah's cover as a loyal member of their organization. The plan required Sarah to maintain her cover while walking directly into a situation where violence was certain to occur. She would need to provide Romano with precise timing and location information while appearing to support Volkov's operation completely. Any mistake or hesitation could result in her death along with Romano's associates. Sarah agreed to Romano's plan, understanding that it represented her only chance for long-term survival and freedom. The alternative was to remain trapped forever between two criminal organizations, constantly risking exposure and facing inevitable discovery. As frightening as the plan was, it offered hope for a final resolution to her impossible situation. The operation took place on a rainy Thursday evening at a warehouse complex near the Chicago River. Sarah arrived with David and several other members of Volkov's organization, playing her role as the nervous girlfriend who was being trusted with important responsibilities for the first time. She carried the false information that was supposed to lure Romano's associates into the ambush. When Romano's people arrived at the designated location, they were prepared for Volkov's ambush and had positioned their own counter-surveillance team throughout the area. The meeting quickly deteriorated into a violent confrontation as both sides realized they had been outmaneuvered. Gunfire erupted throughout the warehouse complex as the two organizations engaged in a deadly battle. Sarah found herself trapped in the middle of the firefight, desperately trying to reach the extraction point Romano had designated while avoiding bullets from both sides. David stayed close to her throughout the chaos, either to protect her or to ensure she couldn't escape. The warehouse filled with smoke and the sound of automatic weapons as the battle intensified. In the confusion of the gunfight, Sarah managed to reach Romano's extraction team, but not before witnessing David's death in the crossfire. Despite everything he had done to control and manipulate her, seeing David killed was traumatic and added another layer of psychological damage to her already fragile mental state. Romano's organization successfully eliminated most of Volkov's key associates during the warehouse battle, effectively ending their rivals' operations in Chicago. Sarah's intelligence had been instrumental in this victory, but the cost in violence and trauma was enormous. She had escaped from one criminal organization only to become permanently indebted to another. In the aftermath of the warehouse battle, Romano honored his promise to provide Sarah with protection and freedom. He arranged for her to receive a new identity and relocation to a city where Volkov's remaining associates couldn't find her. Sarah was given financial resources and assistance in starting a new life, but she understood that she would always be connected to Romano's organization through her knowledge of their activities. Sarah's new life in Seattle was safer, but profoundly lonely. She worked as a substitute teacher under her assumed identity, living quietly and avoiding close relationships that might expose her past. The trauma of her experiences with David and Romano had left her suspicious of others and afraid to trust anyone with the truth about her background. Months passed before Sarah began to understand the full impact of what she had experienced. She suffered from nightmares, anxiety attacks, and depression related to the violence she had witnessed and participated in. The isolation of living under a false identity added to her psychological struggles, as she couldn't seek therapy or support without risking exposure. Sarah also struggled with guilt about the choices she had made. While she had escaped from David's control, her actions had contributed to multiple deaths and had helped one criminal organization destroy another. She questioned whether there might have been other options she could have pursued, even though rational analysis suggested that Romano's protection had been her only realistic chance for survival. The most difficult aspect of Sarah's new life was the knowledge that she could never truly be free. Romano's organization expected her to remain available for future consultation about criminal activities in other cities, and she understood that refusing these requests would end their protection arrangement. She had traded David's direct control for Romano's more distant but equally permanent influence. As Sarah tried to build a new life in Seattle, she received occasional messages from Elena, who served as her ongoing contact with Romano's organization. These communications were usually brief requests for information about people or activities that Sarah might observe in her new location. The requests reminded her that her freedom was conditional and that her debt to Romano would never be fully paid. Sarah's story ended not with triumphant freedom, but with a complex mixture of safety, isolation, and ongoing obligation. She had successfully escaped from David's immediate control and had avoided the violence that might have resulted from attempting to leave through conventional means. However, her liberation had come at the cost of her identity, her relationships, and her peace of mind. Looking back on her experience, Sarah understood that her initial decision to seek Romano's protection had saved her life, even though it had also trapped her in a different kind of prison. She had learned that escaping from dangerous situations sometimes required accepting new forms of danger, and that survival often came with prices that weren't apparent until after the decisions had been made. Sarah's transformation from an innocent kindergarten teacher to a spy in a criminal war illustrated the devastating impact that abusive relationships could have on every aspect of a person's life. Her story served as a reminder that domestic violence involving criminal organizations presented unique challenges that conventional support systems were often inadequate to address. The permanent changes to Sarah's identity and lifestyle demonstrated that some forms of trauma and danger created irreversible consequences that victims had to live with long after the immediate threats had ended. Her ongoing connection to Romano's organization meant that she would never be able to completely escape from the criminal world that David had forced her into. Despite the ongoing challenges and limitations of her new life, Sarah found ways to create meaning and purpose within the constraints of her situation. She became an advocate for other women facing similar dangers, using her experience to help them understand the realities of seeking protection from criminal organizations. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale about the complexity of escaping from abusive relationships that involved organized crime. Years later, Sarah still lived quietly in Seattle, maintaining her assumed identity and carefully managing her connections to Romano's organization. She had learned to find satisfaction in small pleasures and had developed a support network of people who knew her false identity but not her true history. While her life was far from the carefree existence she had once enjoyed, she had achieved a measure of safety and stability that had once seemed impossible.